Falling in love at the airport. I met Violet on the day she was supposed to leave. The airport was crowded, full of people saying goodbye, hugging, crying, promising to visit. I was sitting alone in the waiting area, pretending to read a book, when she sat down next to me. "Hey," she said, like we already knew each other. I looked up. She had short brown hair, a backpack that looked too heavy for her small frame, and the kind of eyes that made you feel like she was always thinking about something important. I blinked. Hey." She nodded toward my book. "You're not actually reading that, are you?" I hesitated. "What?" She smirked. "You've been staring at the same page for 10 minutes. I closed the book. "Okay, fine. Maybe I'm just waiting." "For what?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Something interesting to happen." She laughed, like she actually understood. Then she held out her hand. "I'm Violet." I shook it. "Elliot." She leaned back in her chair, looking around. I love airports. It's like a storybook where every person is a different chapter. I raised an eyebrow. "That's dramatic." She grinned. "Maybe, but think about it. Every person here is either running towards something or leaving something behind." I glanced at the people around us. A woman wiping tears from her eyes. A man checking his watch over and over. A little girl holding a stuffed rabbit like it was the most important thing in the world. I looked back at Violet. "So, which one are you?" She exhaled. "Leaving." "Where to?" She hesitated, then said, "Paris." "Paris?" I repeated. "That's big." "Yeah." She sighed. "Too big." I frowned. "Then why are you going?" She tapped the side of her head. "Because logic says I should." "And what does the rest of you say?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a notebook. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for, then turned the book toward me. The page was filled with names. First names, last names, initials. Some were written neatly. Others scribbled like she had written them in a hurry. I looked at her, confused. "What is this?" She smiled sadly. "Goodbyes." I stared at her. "You collect goodbyes?" She nodded. "Every time I leave a place, I write down the names of the people I said goodbye to. It makes me feel like I'm taking a part of them with me." I didn't know what to say to that. Violet closed the notebook and put it back in her bag. "You know, you could be on the list too." I raised an eyebrow. "But we just met." She shrugged. "Doesn't matter. A goodbye is still a goodbye." There was something about the way she said it. Like she was used to leaving, like she had done 1,000 times before. I looked at the departures board. Her flight was in an hour. I should have just let her go. But instead, I found myself saying something completely ridiculous. "What if you don't leave?" She turned to me, surprised. "What?" I swallowed. "I mean, what if just this once you don't add another name to the list?" Violet stared at me, her fingers resting on the strap of her backpack. For the first time since she sat down, she looked unsure. I didn't know what she would say. I just knew that, for some reason, I didn't want to be another name in a notebook full of goodbyes. Violet stared at me like I had just suggested we rob a bank together. "What do you mean? What if I don't leave?" she asked. I shrugged, suddenly realizing how insane I sounded. "I don't know. Maybe you don't go to Paris. Maybe you stay." She let out a short laugh. "You're serious?" "Kind of." She shook her head, looking amused. "Elliot, my flight leaves in less than an hour." So, She said, I have a ticket. I have a plan. I have a life waiting for me. I raised an eyebrow. Do you? That made her pause, just for a second. But I saw it. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Let me get this straight. You, a complete stranger I met 15 minutes ago, are telling me to cancel my entire future. I frowned. I didn't say cancel, just reconsider. Violet exhaled and rubbed her face. Wow, you really don't believe in small talk, do you? Not really. She studied me for a long moment, then sighed. Okay, let's say I stay. Just for fun. Then what? I blinked. I hadn't thought that far ahead. Well, I said, scrambling for an answer. Then we get coffee. Violet snorted. You want me to change my whole life plan for coffee? Well, yeah, but really good coffee. She gave me a look, but I could tell she was at least considering it. I pressed on. Look, if you want to go, go. But if you're leaving just because it's what you're supposed to do, maybe you should ask yourself if you actually want to. She stared at the departures board, tapping her fingers against her knee. I hate flying, she admitted suddenly. The idea of sitting in a metal tube in the sky for 8 hours? No thanks. See, I said, a solid reason to stay. She rolled her eyes. That's not how life works. Why not? She groaned, throwing her head back. Elliot, you are so annoying. I grinned. Yet, here you are, still talking to me. She shook her head, but she was smiling. Then an announcement came over the speakers. Flight 372 to Paris, final boarding call. Violet's smile faded. She swallowed, staring at the gate. I expected her to stand up, to grab her bag and run. Instead, she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and didn't move. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then she opened her eyes and turned to me. I can't believe I'm saying this, she whispered, but I think I just missed my flight. Violet stared at the departures board like it might suddenly rewind time and give her another chance to leave. But the words "final call" flashed one last time before her flight number disappeared. She let out a breath. Well, that just happened. I nodded. Yep. She turned to me. Do you realize what you just did? I didn't do anything. You decided to stay. She groaned, pulling at her hair. No, you sat here with your annoying logic and made me question everything, and now I'm stranded. I crossed my arms. Stranded? You live here. That's not the point, she said, throwing her hands in the air. The point is, I was supposed to be on a plane to Paris, and now I'm sitting in an airport with you. I smiled. Kind of romantic, if you think about it. She shot me a look. Elliot. Okay, I said, raising my hands. What's your plan now? She groaned again and slumped back into her seat. I have no idea. That made me grin. See? That's exciting. For who? For you. You've been running from place to place your whole life. Maybe now you get to just stay still for a minute. Violet was quiet for a long time. Then she sighed. Okay, fine. Let's pretend this was my brilliant idea. What now? I grinned. Now we get that coffee. She rolled her eyes but stood up anyway. Unbelievable. We grabbed our bags and walked out of the airport together. The coffee shop we ended up in was small, tucked between 2 bookstores, which felt fitting. The kind of place with wobbly tables, too many chairs, and the smell of cinnamon everywhere. Violet cupped her hands around her coffee mug, staring into it like it held the answers to the universe. So, I said, stirring sugar into mine, tell me something real. She raised an eyebrow. What? Something real, I repeated. You seem like the kind of person who's good at telling stories, but I want the truth. No airport metaphors. Violet smirked. You're really bad at small talk, aren't you? Horrible. She exhaled, tapping her fingers against the mug. Then finally she said, I didn't want to go to Paris. I blinked. Then, why were you going? She shrugged. Because it was the next thing. The next place. That's what I do. I go. I leave. It's easier that way. I frowned. Easier than what? She hesitated, then said, easier than staying. There was something in her voice that made my chest ache a little. I didn't push her for more. Instead, I took a sip of my coffee and said, well, congratulations. You're staying. She let out a quiet laugh. Yeah, guess I am. For the first time since I met her, she looked less like someone running away and more like someone figuring out where she actually wanted to be. And for some reason, that made me ridiculously happy. The thing about deciding not to leave is that you suddenly have to figure out what to do instead. Violet poked at the last crumbs of her muffin, deep in thought. So, if I had gone to Paris, I'd be on a plane right now, halfway over the ocean. I took a sip of my coffee. And instead, you're here with me. Lucky you. She smirked. Yeah, so lucky. But there was something in her voice, something softer. I leaned forward. Serious question. What's the longest you've ever stayed in one place? She tilted her head, thinking, 6 months. I raised my eyebrows. That's it? Yep. She shrugged. My mom and I moved all the time. New cities, new countries, new everything. I got used to it. I frowned. Didn't that suck? She gave a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Sometimes. But it also meant I never had to deal with the hard parts of staying. What do you mean? She sighed and leaned back in her chair. When you leave, everything stays perfect. No fights. No disappointments. You only remember the good parts because you never stay long enough for things to get messy. I studied her for a second. That sounds lonely. She looked away. Yeah, well, you get used to it. I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. We just sat there, the noise of the coffee shop filling the space between us. After a minute, she glanced at me. So what about you? Have you ever left? I shook my head. Nope. I've lived in the same house my whole life. Violet's eyes widened. Your whole life? Yep. That's insane. I laughed. It's really not. She crossed her arms. Don't you ever get bored? Not really. There's always something new to notice, even in a place you've seen 1,000 times. She gave me a skeptical look. That sounds like something a boring person would say. I grinned. Or maybe it sounds like something a person who doesn't run away from everything would say. She opened her mouth to argue, but then stopped. Instead, she looked out the window, watching people walk by. Then she smiled. Okay, prove it. I blinked. Prove what? That there's something new to notice. She gestured outside. Show me something interesting about this city. Something I wouldn't see if I were just passing through. I thought about it for a second, then stood up. All right, let's go. She raised an eyebrow. Now. I held out my hand. Trust me? She looked at me for a moment, then sighed dramatically. Fine. But she took my hand. And just like that, Violet, The girl who always left stayed a little longer. The first place I took Violet was the alley behind the library. Wow, she said, looking around. A smelly alley. So impressive. I rolled my eyes. Just wait. We walked past the dumpsters, past the cracked pavement, until we reached the back wall. It was covered in murals, colors swirling together, faces and words and symbols. Some of it was old, faded by time. Some of it was fresh, still bright from the last person who had stood here with a spray can and a dream. Violet tilted her head. This is actually cool. I grinned. Told you. She stepped closer, tracing a hand over the painted bricks. Who did all this? Anyone, I said. Everyone. It started years ago. Someone painted a quote, then someone else added a picture, and it just kept going. Violet smiled. It's like a conversation in colors. I nodded. Exactly. She studied the wall for a long moment. Then she turned to me. Do you have a favorite? I pointed to a small phrase, tucked between a blue sky and a pair of hands reaching for each other. Stay long enough to matter. Violet read it, then looked at me. That's deep. I shrugged. I like it. She was quiet for a second. Then she pulled something out of her pocket. A black marker. I raised an eyebrow. Do you just carry that around? She grinned. You never know when you'll need to leave your mark. She stepped forward and, just below the words I had pointed out, wrote something of her own, or long enough to want to. I stared at it. You're adding to the conversation. She smiled. I guess I am. For someone who had spent her whole life leaving, Violet was starting to look a little like someone who wanted to stay. After the alley, I took Violet to my favorite place in the city, a tiny park hidden between two old buildings. She looked around, unimpressed. This is it. Just wait, I said, leading her past the rusty benches and the lonely swing set. At the very back of the park, behind a wall of ivy, was something most people never noticed. A staircase leading underground. It wasn't locked, just ignored, like a secret nobody had cared to find. Violet's eyes lit up. Okay, now I'm interested. I grinned. I thought you might be. We walked down the stairs into what used to be an old storage space. Over the years, people had turned into something better, a hidden reading nook, filled with mismatched chairs, fairy lights, and shelves packed with books. No signs, no rules, just a quiet place for anyone who needed it. Violet turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. This is amazing. I sat down in one of the old armchairs. Told you there's always something new to notice. She picked up a book from one of the shelves, flipping through the pages. Who even made this place? No one knows. It's just always been here. She smiled. I like that. We sat there for a while, the quiet stretching between us, comfortable and warm. Then Violet sighed. You know, I wasn't supposed to find this. I frowned. What do you mean? She tapped the book in her hands. If I'd gotten on that plane, I never would have known this place existed. I never would have written on that mural. I never would have met you. I swallowed. Do you regret it? She hesitated. Then, softly, she said, No. For someone who had spent her whole life leaving, Violet was finally starting to look like someone who might want to stay. The thing about staying is that eventually you have to decide what it really means. For Violet, I wasn't sure if staying meant forever or just longer than usual. But for now, I was trying not to think about it. We spent the next few days exploring. I showed her all the places that most people overlooked. The rooftop with the best sunset view, The old record store that let you play any album before buying it. The bookstore where the owner always slipped free bookmarks into your bag without saying anything. And for a while, it felt like maybe she belonged here, until the moment she said, "I should probably tell my mom I'm still in the country." I froze. "You haven't told her?" Violet shook her head. "Not yet, but, eventually she'll notice I'm not in Paris." I laughed. "I feel like that should have happened already." She sighed, spinning her coffee cup between her hands. "She'll be mad, but not surprised." "Why?" She hesitated. Then quietly she said, "Because I do this a lot. I disappear, change my plans, run when I feel like running." I frowned. "But you stayed this time." She looked up at me. "Yeah, and that's what scares me." Something in my chest tightened. "Why?" She swallowed. "Because if I stay, it means I care. And when you care, it hurts more when you leave." I shook my head. "Then don't leave." She let out a sad smile. "Elliot, you don't get it. I always leave." I felt my heart sink, because maybe I had been pretending this was something it wasn't. Maybe Violet wasn't staying. Maybe she was just stopping for a while. And the problem with stopping is that eventually you have to decide whether to move again. The next morning, I found Violet sitting on the library steps, staring at her phone. She didn't look up when she said, "I booked a new flight." I felt something in my chest crack open. "Oh," she sighed. "I had to, Elliot. My mom's freaking out. And honestly, this was never supposed to happen. I was never supposed to stay." I sat down next to her. "But you did." She finally looked at me. "Yeah, and that's what makes this harder." I wanted to tell her to stay. I wanted to tell her that the city could be enough, that I could be enough, but I wasn't sure if that was fair. So instead I asked, "Do you want to go?" She exhaled. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just scared of what happens if I don't." I nodded because I got it. Staying meant roots, and roots meant risk. It meant people could disappoint you. It meant you couldn't just run away when things got complicated. But it also meant something else. "You know what I think?" I said. She raised an eyebrow. "What?" I pointed at the sky. "I think if you really wanted to leave, you'd already be gone." Violet stared at me. Then she let out a laugh, short and breathless, like she couldn't believe me. "You're impossible." "I know." She shook her head, smiling. This was not my plan. Maybe that's a good thing. She bit her lip, glancing at her phone one more time. Then, slowly, she locked the screen and slid it into her pocket. "Come on," she said, standing up. I frowned. "Where are we going?" She grinned. "To find a can of spray paint. I think I need to add something new to that mural." I laughed, shaking my head. But I followed her because I already knew Violet wasn't getting on that plane. She was staying. And maybe, for the first time, she wanted to.